article that covers Brown v. Board of Education. Before we begin reading, I want you all to think about this question. Have you ever felt like people have judged you because of the way you looked? We won't be sharing our answers to this question out loud, but please take a few minutes to write down the answer on a piece of paper. All right, now that most of us have finished writing, let's begin reading. While we're reading, I'm going to be helping you identify important pieces of information from the article that will help you write an end summary. We're going to be reading Brown v. Board of Education. It's an article on pbs.org. With the words separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed more than a half century of legalized segregation. The landmark case was Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. I've highlighted this because it tells us the date in which the court case occurred. I think it's very important when writing summaries that we look at dates. Oliver and Linda Brown. The case was named after Oliver Brown of Topeka, Kansas, an African-American man whose daughter Linda faced a long commute to school every day. Linda had been denied admission to an all-white neighborhood school just 5 blocks from her home. So I've highlighted this because it gives us a little bit of background as to why the case happened in the first place. The case became a class action suit involving 5 states consolidated under Brown once they reached the Supreme Court. The 2 lead attorneys were Charles H. Houston and Thurgood Marshall, the architects of the NAACP's legal strategies. Marshall would later become the nation's first African-American Supreme Court justice. The court's opinion. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion read on May 17, 1954. Again, we have another very important date, so I've gone ahead and I've highlighted it. The court's language incorporated some of the main points argued by African Americans that segregation generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to be done. So I think this is a really powerful quote that kind of sums up the feelings that African Americans had about segregation, so I've gone ahead and I've highlighted it as well. Calling card for a new era. African Americans took the decision as a calling card for a new era of progress and opportunity. Let's take a look at this underlined quote right here. Basically, I've underlined this because it summarizes the feeling that one group of African Americans felt about this decision to end segregation. Grassroots organizations gained momentum and membership. More blacks registered to vote. Membership in the NAACP soared, especially in northern cities, and foot soldiers for the organization gained the confidence and audacity to set up field offices in the South. Black veterans in World War II, disappointed to find Jim Crow brutally staring them in the face, were hopeful the Supreme Court decision would bring in a tide of change, if not for them, then for their children. So basically, I've highlighted this because I think it also helps summarize the feeling of hope that so many African Americans had after the Supreme Court decided to put an end to segregation. Segregationist opposition. Most of the South remained vehemently opposed. So, I've highlighted this because it shows a contrasting view. To many African Americans, segregation was a great thing, whereas to many people in the South, they were very upset that segregation was coming to an end. In Mississippi, considered to be the most staunchly segregationist southern state, the response was swift and vitriolic. An editorial in the Jackson Daily News called the decision the worst thing to have happened to the South since carpetbaggers and scalawags took charge of our civil government in Reconstruction days, and said it would lead to a racial strife of the bitterest sort. The Daily News joined all major elected officials in Mississippi in a vow to fight the decision. Even though it was delivered by a unanimous vote of the 9 members of the nation's highest tribunal, the editorial read, "Mississippi cannot and will not try to abide by such a decision." The summer of 1955. 1 year after the Brown decision in 1955, once again, this is 1 year after the decision has been made, so I've gone ahead and I've highlighted it. Many whites in the Deep South remained determined to block its implementation. It was an election year in Mississippi, and politicians used their influence to back segregationist candidates. African American African Americans attempting to exercise their right to vote or register to vote were met with severe and often deadly resistance. So I've gone and I've highlighted this because it shows that these two opposing sides, one pro-segregation and one against segregation, were very they were in conflict with each other, and it led to a lot of negative feelings towards each other. 3 African Americans, including Emmett Till, were brutally killed that summer. When classes started in fall of 1955, Mississippi schools remained rigidly segregated. So I've highlighted this because it shows that even though the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation was over, we still had schools in the South that refused to unsegregate their schools. Years later, when the state government finally conceded that it could not remain segregated in violation of the Supreme Court decision, segregationist whites would choose to withdraw their children from public school rather than send them to school with African Americans. This is the last sentence, and I think it's very important, so I've highlighted it because it shows us how even though the Supreme Court had ruled it illegal, we still had people that were so upset by this decision, even a year or so later, that would rather pull their kids out of school entirely than make them go to school with African American children. So now that we've highlighted the entirety of the article, we can go ahead and look at all the important information that we've underlined, and we can basically pull that into one summary. It helps if you just go in order and take everything in order. So we can start with when it occurred in 1954 and why the case happened, and then get into some feelings about the opposition. And this is the summary I've written. Brown v. Board of Education was named after Oliver Brown and his daughter, Linda Brown, when Linda was not allowed to go to school that was only 5 blocks from her home because it was an all-white school. The court decided on May 17, 1954, that the segregation of schools was no longer allowed. Many African Americans considered the decision made during Brown v. Board of Education as a stepping stone for them to have more freedom. They were hopeful that the decision would be the first step to more freedom for them and their children. However, much of the South did not agree with the decision that the Supreme Court had made. In many cases, when African Americans tried to vote, they were denied. 1 year after the Supreme Court decision in 1955, when schools started, states like Mississippi remained segregated. When the state government demanded that this was no longer allowed, many people decided to pull their children out of school instead of allowing them to attend school with African American children. So basically, I've just pulled in all of our highlighted information and I've written it into a summary, and I really hope that helps provide an example for when you write your own summary for this article.